Well, my clock has struck noon here in Chicago, so we are going to get started. My name is Seth Green, and on an afternoon like this one, I am especially grateful to say that I'm the Dean of the Graham School at the University of Chicago. And it is a tremendous honor to welcome you to this Alumni Discourse series on Iris Murdoch's The Sovereignty of Good, where we will be investigating the second chapter on God and Good. The series is led by the Hyde Park Institute, and we are thrilled to be a collaborator at the Graham School. The Hyde Park Institute, for those who are not familiar, is a tremendous resource for our students and community at the University of Chicago, and it helps our community to develop their moral character. The Institute works with 45 faculty and staff, and I'm looking at one of those incredible faculty right now, to offer 4-credit courses, year-long lecture series, and seminars, all with the ultimate aim of helping our students envision the person they want to become, the character they want to possess, and then working to become that person. The Graham School, for those who are not familiar, is now 132 years into our founding mission of bringing the incredible resources of this institution to learners across all ages and stages of their life. Our aim is ultimately to help people to better understand the world and to live examined lives of purpose. And we are thrilled to be launching a new initiative across the university that Graham is a partner in, called the Leadership and Society Initiative, for people who are thinking about leadership later in life for society. And one of the speakers, David Brooks, and his partner, Ann Snyder, have been wonderful advisors and will be teaching in that initiative this upcoming year. So it's a very special honor to be here and to be hosting and to be a part of this series. When we get started, we are going to hear about this very important text. And we're going to be looking this time at the second of the chapters, because last week we were able to investigate the first. And next week, for those who are able to join us again, we will be investigating the third. The speakers, Candace Vogler and David Brooks, have already been introduced to you, but I will just give the briefest of introductions again. Candace is the David B. and Clara E. Stern Professor of Philosophy. She is the author of 2 books, John Stuart Mill's Deliberative Landscape and Reasonably Vicious, which was published by Harvard University Press. And she writes and teaches on topics related to ethics, social and political philosophy, moral philosophy and literature, cinema, psychoanalysis, gender studies, and sexuality studies. David Brooks is an alumnus of the college and was a member of the university's board of trustees. He is a political and cultural commentator who, since 2003, has been a columnist for the New York Times, and he is a contributing editor to The Atlantic and a commentator on the NewsHour. He has many books, including 2 that are very relevant to this topic, The Road to Character and The Second Mountain. And he has another book coming out in October, How to Know a Person, that I know I am very excited to read and to learn from. And so with that, it is my pleasure to turn it over to the 2 of you. You will, I know, have a discussion for about 40 minutes, and then we will come to questions and answers. That is my way of letting the audience know that the Q&A is open. So please start chatting in your questions, and we will come to them later in the program. And David, I see you leaning in, so maybe you're gonna get us started, but I'll turn it over openly, and whoever speaks first will be the one who gets us going.
Okay, I guess I'll go first. I'm not at home today. I'm at the New York Times in New York, so I'm anxious because God knows when heads may roll around here. So I'll speak quickly before they get rid of me. So I'm going to maybe set up why I think this essay is worth paying attention to, even though it's a little more difficult than the previous one. And then maybe Candace can tell us what on earth Iris Murdoch is trying to do. And so I'll start with the passage in the middle of the essay, where Iris Murdoch writes, "What is a good man like? How can we make ourselves morally better? Can we make ourselves morally better? These are questions the philosopher should try to answer." Now, when I read that in the middle of this essay, my first reaction was, isn't that the whole point of philosophy? I mean, what on earth is philosophy doing but those questions? But I have to confess, having taught at a school known as the University of Chicago of New Haven, Connecticut, for many years, I had many students come into my classes who were had majored in philosophy because they thought that's what they were going to be doing. And they found, at least at Yale, that a lot of the times they weren't doing that. And so they wanted to do it somewhere else. And so I really love Murdoch's efforts here is she's making an attempt to give us, I think, not only an answer to those questions, but a more modern answer. And I would just try to, for a few minutes, put it in, to me, a historical context. And so, our founders founded this country with a very low and realistic view of human nature. Benjamin Franklin said at one point, people are pretty poorly made. They tend to be selfish, short-sighted, and Adams, Madison, God knows Madison, the founders all sort of embraced this idea that we are wonderfully made and totally broken. And so the conclusion they drew, if we're going to try to make a democracy out of these people, we've got to train them. And by training, they meant moral formation. And to me, moral formation sounds like a sort of a high-flown, maybe old-fashioned word, but to me, it means three simple things. First, to help you restrain your selfishness, so you're not as selfish as you might otherwise be. Second, how to find an ultimate purpose and goal in your life, so that you have a direction to aim your life at and a way to measure whether your life is meaningful or not. And third, how to be considerate toward people in the complex situations of daily life. How to break up with somebody without breaking their heart, how to disagree with civility, how to be a proper friend, how to sit with someone who is suffering. And those three things, when you break it down, are not as highfalutin, but kind of practical. And I would say this view of moral formation was at the center of American history, and probably Western history, since the beginning, and it pervaded. So in the 19th century, for example, there were the Sunday school movement, the regular school movement, the YMCA, the Boys and Girl Scouts clubs, the unions and the guilds were doing moral formation. There was a whole panoply of organizations all trying to morally form the people within them. And that happened in Europe. There was a thing called the Bildung movement, which was in Germany and especially in Scandinavia. It was a form of education which said, our job as educators is not to get people into college. Our job is to produce people with more complex inner lives who understand their responsibilities as citizens. And so it's this deeply humanistic thing, and the University of Chicago's Great Books program is one of the many things that come out of the Bildung. And then if you go through the history of American education, that's what schools were for. Schools were for to do moral formation, to answer the Murdoch questions. And you can go back to the early HBCUs, said the characters, the formation is the central job of universities. John Dewey, who we think of as a progressive, said schools should be doing moral formation every hour of the day, 5 days a week. And so one of my heroes is a woman named Frances Perkins, who went to Mount Holyoke, which was a typical school. She was probably in the class of 1904, 1905. And the school was mostly about doing moral formation. And they had rules that probably wouldn't fly at University of Chicago today. So one of the rules for the students was a freshman shall bow in the presence of a sophomore. Freshmen were not allowed to talk to sophomores until the middle of the first year. And so these seem a little archaic to us, but they were intended to teach humility. And Holyoke also had a phrase, go where no one wants to go, do what no one wants to do. And if you look at the missionaries in the 1920s, the female missionaries abroad in Tibet and Africa and across Asia, about 20% of them were Holyoke grads. It was this intensely morally passionate place that sent off Frances Perkins and many people like her. And so that is just part of the wash of American life, all these institutions. And then in my view, it goes away right after World War II. And if you look at, there was a guy named Joshua Liebman, who was a rabbi who wrote a book, and I've forgotten the name of his book right now, but the core theme was, you are innately good. Human beings are innately good. And it sat atop #1 New York Times bestseller for 56 weeks in a row. And then there were a whole series of books making the same point, climaxing with the power of positive thinking. And all of this was, you are innately good. And if people are innately good, you don't need to do moral formation. And all you got to do is get people released, liberated from the strictures of society, and they'll be innately good. And this idea filters through psychology. It filters through the Girl Scouts. If you look at the Girl Scout manuals in the 1890s, it was all about how to be a better woman, or And by the 1970s, it was like, get into you, discover you, actualize you. And so there's a shift. And so if you look at the use of moral language, I think I mentioned this last week, it all tends to plummet over the course of the 20th century, use of the word courage, humility, kindness. People just stopped talking about it. And then I may have mentioned this, Tony Kronman, my former Yale colleague, wrote a book called The Ends of Education about how the university used to be in charge of putting out good human beings. Now it's in charge of producing knowledge, and it became demoralized. And so to me, we enter a world that's not bad, but demoralized, where this project of becoming a better person is somehow in the back of anybody's mind, but nobody knows how to do it. And certainly nobody knows how to tell somebody else to do it. And so what intrigues me and why I think Murdoch is so important is she's reintroducing the topic, throwing it on the table. But second, she's not doing it in a way that seems archaic. The archaic form of character formation is like hydraulics. You've got all these nasty things called passions. You've got this strong dam called willpower, and you use willpower to control the passions. That A, probably doesn't work. B, it doesn't, it's too, like, frankly, macho. And I find it unpersuasive as a way to form character. So she's going beyond, and last week we talked about how much emphasis she puts on perception and looking, and how much emphasis she puts on the everyday, on being a genius at the near at hand. And that seems to be a much more approachable, less Victorian form of moral formation. And now in this essay, and now I'll throw it over to Candace, what she seems to be doing is like looking for a beauty that can allure us, the contemplation of which will produce some sort of inner change. And that's, I think, the task she sent that. And it strikes me as a pseudo-Christian task from a non-Christian. And she's assigned what some people would view the contemplation of Christ, she's assigning to the contemplation of art. But Candace, you can clarify for us what she's doing here.
Thank you, David. For what it's worth, I share your view about what philosophy is and what it's supposed to be doing. And at least in my classes, we do talk explicitly about what's going on when you're trying to be a better person, a lot. Not just because I'm an ethics professor, it's the way that we're doing economics under my tutelage this quarter. But Murdoch wants to, I mean, one of the themes that came out really strongly last week is that we're supposed to be giving just and loving attention to our fellow human beings, that a human being is the sort of creature that calls for just and loving attention on the part of fellow human beings, right? And just and loving are both evaluatively loaded terms, right? Justice, queen of virtues of sorts, love, incredible power and viewer of good in human life. So in this essay, she's trying to think about how it is that you can have an experience, a direct experience of good, right? I mean, she starts with, and that when people believed in God, she thinks that very few people do anymore. That I think that's not quite true, but I think there's a huge number of monotheists of various flavors in the world, and probably they outnumber the atheists, but that's not Murdoch's experience. She thinks that it used to be the case that monotheistic religious practice gave people a way of having something that felt like intimate relation with good, where good is like one of the names of God in most monotheistic traditions. There's some disagreement in contemporary Islam over whether all goodness is the best way to think about Allah, but certainly it provided a focus, and she's pretty much aware of the Christian heritage of her world. even though she thinks that most of the people in her world are no longer deeply believing, faithful, practicing Christians. So the question is, without God as an orientation point, how is it that you're supposed to get a set of practices or ways of being oriented to the world that focus on good? And she's using beauty as a kind of stand-in for good in this particular piece. And she's thinking that what goes with appreciating great works of art is something like an approach to beauty that is a bit like the approach to good that we would be getting out of turning a just and loving eye on our fellow human beings. The kind of understanding of good that is back behind that and that is somehow apprehended when we see each other in the right sort of way. She's using art as a kind of stand-in for that aspect of interpersonal relations. And she's using beauty, as near as I can tell, as just the name for whatever it is that is alluring, attractive, enticing, and gripping about great works of art. So it's not that she's claiming that there's a form of the beautiful and that great works of art are somehow participating in it. This would be a kind of Platonic view of the matter, but she's supposing that if I were to think about works of art that have moved me greatly over the course of my life, this quality of whatever it is that's drawing me to them, we could name that beauty. And I mean, nowadays, I think we would be as likely to look to scenes in nature for that experience as we would be to works of art. I think that the splendor of sunsets, of mountain vistas, of the desert in a thunderstorm, these might be the kinds of things that would make us feel like we were in contact with something that was unitary, real, gripping, and transcendent. And that it wouldn't matter what scene it was that was having this profound impact on us, that we would sense that there was something the same in all of these experiences. And you could call whatever is the same in all of those experiences beauty. And that would be a little like what she's pulling on in riffing on Shakespeare or Cezanne or particular works of music or something like that. This idea that there's some commonality across these experiences that looks like it's connecting the person who is having the profound experience to something that's unitary, transcendent, that is real, it necessarily exists, but it can't be represented. It has to just be experienced, okay? So that's how she's using thought about art and beauty, as near as I can tell. It's a way of trying to put, give the good feet and put it on the ground with us so that we can be engaged in a genuine and powerful experience of goodness, okay? We'd only have it in the context of particular moments in our life or particular relationships or particular kinds of things, but so it's not like it is in any sense otherworldly. It has to be understood as real and with us. And as necessarily existing, if only as the thing we have to point to in order to make sense of these experiences. So she's not supposing a subsistent form of the good, or I mean, to use Plato talk, she's not doing that here. But it makes her discussion of love from last week look a little more like Eros in Plato's Symposium, this force that's moving through us and enlivening us and actually directing us to the finest and best things, even if it initially shows itself in pretty low-key stuff. So my sense is that that's where she's going. At various points, she talks about how psychoanalytic thought fails to either provide an alternative or a remedy for the thirst that we have, that the kind of knowledge that we're supposed to be getting of ourselves from psychoanalysis does not appear to get us where we want to be if what we're trying to do is answer those critical questions. And that Marx has another name for the kind of trouble we'll face if we're attempting to locate the source of this human experience, and we're so likely to get it wrong. We're so likely to wind up in fantasy or delusion, right? That psychoanalysis gives us one picture of that kind of delusion. Marx gives us another picture of that kind of delusion. She wants us to be non-deluded and to actually have the experience of the good be as central and important to us as the worship of God would be to a believer. And beauty is a stand-in for whatever that experience might be.
And I ask you what she means by beauty. So the piece of this I like is it does feel true. We taught a course on Burke a little while ago, and we agreed, or at least I agreed with myself, that it's important that Burke wrote a book on aesthetics before he wrote a book on moral philosophy, because he understood our sentiments to be trustworthy. And I do think most of our moral senses are sentimental, that you don't need to decide if something is good or bad, you know right away. And when the neurocognitive scientists do these studies and they ask you even morally complex subjects like euthanasia, people make intuitive judgments within a second, even when you present them with something that's actually kind of complicated to think about. I do think, Jonathan Haidt at NYU has sort of elaborated on what kind of moral sentiments we're sometimes guided by, and they feel aesthetic. I see someone asking generously, my heart swells. I see someone kicking a kid. I don't need to think about it. It's intuitively disgusting. And so I like that part. But then when I think about the times I felt the kind of moral elevation in contemplating beautiful works of art that she's describing, I think it feels like one kind, but not another. And the not another, it feels like, I'll fess up to my luxury-ridden life. I was in the Dominican Republic 2 weeks ago, and I was at a truly beautiful hotel. And always go in January. It was like 5% full. It was great. But it felt beautiful. Like the architecture was beautiful, the interior design. You could look out on the ocean, and it felt beautiful. It did not feel morally uplifting to me. It just felt beautiful. On the other hand, when I think of some of the works of art that really do seem beautiful to me, and I happen to I've always been a fan of Annunciation paintings, especially from the Renaissance period, or Rembrandt's painting of the Prodigal Son, or La Pietà. These strike me as aesthetically beautiful, but they also contain stories and they seem morally beautiful to me. And so that kind of beauty seems a lot more compelling to me than a very nicely designed interior living room. No knock on interior decorators.
Well, I mean, I share your sense. I mean, I'm sort of the kind of works of art that have the effect for me that she's describing. I confess to being a huge fan of the Northern European Renaissance more than the Italian Renaissance. I mean, I was thinking this morning about Hieronymus Bosch, about Bruegel, and also about Lucas Cranach the Elder, whose work I love, and thinking about that stuff alongside cave paintings, right? And those things are partly intellectually elevating, right? Cave paintings, there's this direct, powerful. I mean, the Cave of the Hands is unbelievable. The caves in Australia, the cave paintings in the Northern Territories in Australia are unbelievable. And there's this odd sense that you're connecting spiritually with another group of people who are making pictures of their spiritual engagement with the natural world. Those, for me, have the kind of effect that she's describing. I'm not, certain works of music also just grab me. But I don't think that, I mean, the way that it's not possible for people who have certain kinds of religious practices to not feel the hand of God in the beauty of the natural world somehow, however small or big that might be. So for those people, a certain kind of aesthetic appreciation taps onto what she's really trying to capture. I mean, what she's wanting is some sort of a spiritual sense that can be addressed and engaged in ordinary human life. I think that's what she's after. And that's why she's viewing Freud and Marx as the great debunkers. But as near as I can tell, that's what she's after. And I agree with you. Even the most exquisite interior design doesn't quite do it.
Yeah, I want to get to Freud and Marx in a minute, but I once read a passage somewhere that the contemplation of nature is the preparation for religion, but it's not religion, and that it elevates your soul in a way that you're likely to welcome in some idea of a creator or some idea of transcendent beauty, but it is not the actual act of surrendering yourself to a code or obeying a set of commandments or mitzvahs or blessings. And I wanted to ask you if maybe this is an unrepresentative sample of her work, but if it's not a little solipsistic, and the idea that one can contemplate beauty and become more beautiful. I do think you can have a more just and loving attention, but the things we really care about are like, are you a good friend? Are you faithful to someone in tough times? It seems that she is weirdly trying to create a moral system without a communal structure.
I think that's right. I think that it's partly the absence of community that's the biggest hollow point in this second essay. And she's the depth of our sociality, which you would hope would be coming through in this just and loving attention. It does not appear to be coming through. So, I mean, I agree with you that it's the absence of that I think has to be felt most keenly here. I think it's interesting that her location for beauty is in artifacts, right? Human-made things, that's where she's locating beauty. Without thinking about the complexity of the community involved and the audiences involved in making art much at all. I mean, it's not what she's thinking about.
Yeah.
And she's not thinking about the deep sociability in human beings, and that as being the place where we would live out any kind of spiritual experience we had.
Yeah. I wanted to ask you about her take on Freud, because it gets us into her take on human nature. And the way I see it, she was writing in, I don't know when she gave the lectures, probably 1970 or somewhere around there. And Freud obviously still had a lot more purchase than he does now. And I think one of the reasons people have begun to move away from Freud, while always everyone respects him, but some of his I would say, his overly dark and sex-obsessed take on human nature, we've begun to walk away from it. I'll just focus on the darkness because I think she sort of accepts the darkness. Even in the third lecture, which I guess we'll get to next week, she comes right out and says people are basically selfish. And to me, one of the ways the cognitive sciences have moved is an awareness of the many ways people are not selfish. And that it's on this point of community that we evolve to become extremely good cooperators. And altruism is a real thing. And that always hesitate in the presence of a philosopher to raise mere social science, but there are all these social science experiments where they ask people in one way or another, they give you a chunk of money, you've got a partner you don't really know, do you want to share it or not? And a real selfish species would not share it. Like, there's no benefit to sharing it, except there's some other guy sitting over there. But in all studies across all human societies, there'll be about 30% who will behave the way economists tell them to behave, which is they just keep the money. But in no society is there a population where the majority behave that way. In every society, the majority of people share to some significant degree. And that's just some sense of, we are cooperative, of course we're going to share. We want to see ourselves as the sort of person who would share. And it seems to me that some of the reason we walked away from Freud is an overly dark, that the unconscious is seen as this dark tangle of hidden and sometimes vicious drives, and we no longer really see the unconscious that way.
Yeah, I mean, the reader of Freud I respect the most is actually a really difficult figure called Jacques Lacan. And I'm kind of a Lacanian, and I think what he saw was true. He thought, and this would actually coincide with some of the things that Murdoch is trying to bring out. He thought that the biggest struggle for modern liberal individuals was an absence of any secure, shared sense of normative authority, right? And that you could see the various kinds of, what neuroses become for Lacan are strategies for dealing with the fact that you've got this huge question, not so much about being, a la Heidegger, but about good, that's sitting at the center of everyone, and no clear shared understanding of an authority that backs this quest for good, right? And that's the way to think about the chief problems in contemporary life, is as no shared sense of normative authority. And that's what he finds in Freud. He's a very good and close reader of Freud, but he finds in Freud this incredible hunger and search for a source of normative authority. And what he reads in all of the bits of psychoanalytic speech that Freud is working from with his women, who are the ones who, his patients, who are the ones who teach him psychoanalysis, is just this peculiar kind of lostness. It's like they would love to be obedient to a genuine source of normative authority and allow it to guide their lives. They would love that, but they can't discern that there is one. And most of the voices that purport to be providing that kind of guidance, they think can't be it. And that's the deal at the center of psychoanalysis for Lacan. And that strikes me as, in certain respects, true, and is part of what Murdoch is screaming in these essays and trying to address, right? And so if that's how you read Freud, then he's not after a cure, because what would it mean to cure that question mark? What you've got to do is learn how to live with that question mark, which is a real, central, and crucially important question, which is right at the core of the three questions that she raises in the middle of this essay. It's like, if there is such an authority, then what we ought to do is obey it. she's very clear on there not being solid grounds for obedience, and that being part of what is at issue in the struggle that she's mapping out for us. So I would think that on what I take to be a really attentive and sound reading of Freud, and hopeful and optimistic reading of Freud, like what has he actually found here that's a problem? It's not a tangle of, aggression at the core of our being or something like that. It's the incredible desire to be good, and the sense that you can be found wanting in indefinitely many ways at any moment. And that the way to think about the strange hollowness of the modern self is as a set of efforts on the part of the psyche to sort of produce the version of yourself that would not be worthy of reproach in the relevant register. He calls them like coats in a props department, each of which is designed to dress you up in a form that looks acceptable given how you're feeling unacceptable at this moment, right? And that you can't, given the number of things with points of judgmentalism that we face, and the fact that there does not seem to be a single and coherent understanding of the norms that we're answerable to, that we are at a loss about what it would be to be the right sort of person, at what it would be to be good in the right kinds of ways. And that feeling of being at a loss about this is one of the most important aspects of contemporary life. And I think that could be part of what she's trying to put her finger on in this particular essay. I mean, and treating Freud and Marx as names of two still in her contemporary world figures who look like they're somehow pointing out the destitution at the center of life for ourselves.
That's helpful, because it again helps me situate her in her moment in time. So we've lost this ultimate authority, at least for many non-religious people. And at about that time, the big answer, which I tried to describe in my potted history of the 20th century, was the ultimate authority to which one went to for the source of good and evil was self, was the actualized self. And this is Maslow, and this is Carl Rogers, the psychologist. And they would have been at their peak of their influence probably around the time she's giving their lectures. And it devolves in a more political sense, and I think actually in a more challenging sense, into the idea that freedom is the ultimate source of good and the ultimate authority to which we look at for good. And therefore, I should be able to make the choices that are right for me. And that's my choice. That me exercise freedom is the ultimate good. And she has a sentence in this lecture, it's on page 68 in my edition: good, not will, is transcendent. And so she's putting this good, which she associates, I guess, with beauty, above mere choice, mere self.
Yeah, I mean, a way that you can see what she's up to here is as just this strong suggestion that the biggest challenge each of us is facing is getting over himself or herself. Like, how do you get over yourself? And you better be able to get over yourself, or no beautiful, good, lovely, or worthwhile things are going to be able to come your way in reality. So how do you get over yourself? And that would seem to be a kind of transcendence. Like, you got to transcend the allure of yourself in order to be on to anything else.
I'll just say, as a matter of empirics, I know some artists and I know some art critics, people who spent their lives contemplating beauty, and getting over yourself is not one of the traits I would necessarily associate with them.
Neither would I. Neither would I. Yeah. It's kind of the last thing I would say about the ones I know the most about.
Yeah.
No, and it's not just contemporary artists who seem to think that their task is self-expression. That's not just 20th century and more recent people who seem to have this as the vision of what it is to do art.
Yeah. Now, we're going to go to questions in a minute, but there's one other passage which I was hoping to raise with you, which sometimes I believe in beau ideals. I believe in the Shakespeare, if you're Christian, in the Jesus. I believe in the unapproachable, and I believe in holding up those ideals. Somewhere I read of a Spartan educator, because he said, "My job is to make honorable things enjoyable to the youth." And I always like that saying, because he's trying to hold up a real ideal. And I never had words to explain why holding up a high ideal is so important. And she has a sentence on page 60 in my edition: "One cannot feel unmixed love for a mediocre moral standard any more than one can for a work of mediocre artist." And so if I'm going to hold up a realistic ideal to you, you'll think, kind of nice, like an average painting in a studio on the street, like, kind of nice. But if you really want to be fired for the good, it's got to be a pretty great good. And if you really want to be fired for a piece of art, it's got to be a great piece of art. And I think we have some people on the call who have written on AI generated art. And I think one of the things that one notices, at least so far, and I think forever, is that it does not have the sublime beauty of a human-made piece of art, and that there's something ineluctably and deeply human in the capacity to generate and appreciate a beauty that the deep that calls into deep.
I would agree.
Yeah.
And AI generated essays would not get A's from me either.
No.
Well, this has been a beautiful discussion, morally beautiful, I should qualify that with. And we do have a number of questions in the chat. And so I'll get us started on them. And to connect, so I'll read both, but I think there may be a chance to offer one set of insights on them. Dan Culleton asked, how could you have a conception of objective goodness, truth, or beauty without God? And then later on, John McNamee asked, didn't Nietzsche already raise the issue of what mankind would have to replace Christianity? And so I guess both are getting at this kind of question of, if there is not God, how do we get to that sense of good, and what does that construction look like? And do you find hints in Murdoch's work that give insight to what can replace, to the points that you've made, we're kind of without that, unified understanding, what can replace that from a philosophy perspective?
I'll let you go, David.
First, on the goodness without God. It's a question that I'm a columnist. I don't have to deal with these questions. I guess I would say, I do think reasonably persuasively, I happen to believe in a God, so I do believe there is an ultimate standard of goodness and truth and beauty. But I have to say that for all us religious people talk about goodness, our behavior is not that much better than the atheists. And so I draw from that a belief that it is possible to believe in a universal moral order without being explicitly religious. And I think there are so many people who look at, say, slavery now, who are atheists, who believe that is objectively and in all times and all circumstances wrong, rape is in all circumstances wrong, murder, etc., and that it's not hard to generate a reasonably absolute moral system, maybe based on evolutionary roots, but I would say based at the very least upon the accumulated wisdom of the ages. And that it may not be absolute, but if you're living, and this is how I felt when I went to Chicago when I really was an atheist, that if you're living according to the accumulated wisdom of many, many, many hundreds of generations of human beings, there's some residue there on which you can pretty reliably hang your hat.
Thank you. I mean, because I teach ethics, one of the first things I have to do with my students is convince them that they walk into the room with moral knowledge. So there is something to have I do moral philosophy, there needs to be something that it's the philosophy of, and that what we're going to read has got to be answerable to the moral knowledge that they walked in the door with, because that's the first order that this is trying to theorize. And what my students have is a deep understanding of absolute prohibition. Genocide and rape are the two most likely candidates. And if I ask students who have no particular religious background what is offended by these things, what they will say is something like humanity. They think there is such a thing as humanity, and that it's the kind of thing that we're supposed to be recognizing and appreciating in one another, and that we're supposed to be promoting in the way that we go through life. So they think that a non-particularly religiously inflected understanding of the human and of humanity and of the joys and suffering of human beings has got to provide a sort of a core for us that we're answerable to. So they're very sensitive to the thought that there are such things as crimes against this, and that crimes against it are crimes against something real, right? And each of us is a carrier of this real thing, and we're supposed to be on to this point about all people, and that, so there's that as a kind of secular possibility for them. And they'll point to things like love and suffering and joy and momentous occasions like birth and death as a way of saying the name of the kind of thing that they think is transcendent and realized in each person. And that would be the sort of thing that she wants good to be. Or beauty in the works of art or something like that.
You talked earlier about how there's not necessarily a lot of focus on community. So there's the sense of restraining self, but not maybe the other side, which is what does that formation look like of community? And so a question from Jerry Ree coming out about that time in your discussion, there is also a political philosophy that recognizes moral formation of community as a target for what is supposed to be doing, and not merely for the individual human being. Can you offer insight on how to think about that moral formation of community? And, you know, David, I think of some of your thoughts in the Second Mountain, among other places, and how you kind of evolved even from the road to moral character into the Second Mountain, thinking about that move from individual to community. So not to put the pressure on you, but maybe we'll come to you first on that.
Yeah, I have now moving to the point, I don't know if it's an Aristotle point, but I think it is, that most moral formation happens in community.
Yeah.
And that the idea that I can sit by myself in a room and bootstrap my up into being a really good person is probably not a realistic way to think about it. And that we learn virtues the way we learn crafts, through the practice of them, and with that, those practices are mostly shaped by the norms that are built into our communities. I mentioned my hero Edmund Burke again. He has a famous passage that manners are more important than laws, that laws touch us here and there, but manners touch us everywhere. And they are the purification of character or the destruction of character. And by manners, he includes things like saying please and thank you, but he's really talking about ways of being. And so when you are in the Jewish tradition and somebody dies, it's not intuitively obvious that you should be asked to host a party for a week. But it turns out that the Shiva rituals are an extremely practical and psychologically sophisticated for handling grief, but they're a statement about what a community is and who we are with each other in times of trouble. And you don't have to think about what does Shiva mean, but if you do Shiva, you have inherited a sense of values. And so I do think the effort here to, and of course, again, I'm putting her too much in her own context, but she's writing at the time when the great rebellion was against conformity and against collectivism. and people want to be individualistic. And so I understand why she wasn't going there, but I think, I don't know if most people writing now would place a lot more emphasis on community, and they'd probably pull in some evolutionary psychology that we have these systems because we're just so phenomenally good at communal cooperation.
Yeah, I mean, I agree. I mean, my own view is that moral formation always happens in community, never, in complete isolation. And that if you want to produce an environment in which people are supported in their interest in becoming better human beings, what you need to do is make a certain kind of community to hold it and to produce sites for the kind of engagement that allow it to grow. And so I believe this utterly and firmly. I mean, not that I think I can't, given my life, can't believe that you're just completely lost if you don't have that at all points growing up. But it's at least differently difficult if you're growing up in a setting where you're kind of isolated and at risk.
Eugene Wedoff asks, is empathy the basis for morality, a conviction that the good of other people is a criterion for action? And I'm curious just for your reflections and reactions to, empathy in that question of good and beauty and kind of how you see those connected.
Yeah, I guess I'd lead off. It's important to be clear what empathy is. And it's easy to overestimate empathy. And so to me, empathy is three different skills. The first is mirroring. If I'm with you and you're displaying an emotion, that I more or less catch it and I feel what you're feeling. And so that's, a lot of people think that's what empathy is. It's a feeling. You just feel for someone. But, and a lot of people now base it on mirror neurons, that we replicate in my mind what I see in your mind. But that can't be all of empathy, because the macaque monkeys who we found mirror neurons, apparently they're nasty little buggers. So they're selfish and mean to each other. And so that's not all. But the first stage is mirroring. And the second stage is mentalizing. And that's when I use my own experience to try to imagine what you're probably going through. So it's your first day on the job. I've had first days on the job. I imagine you're feeling excited. I imagine you're a little imposter syndrome. You're a little uncomfortable around all these people. And so all these different emotions are going on through your mind. And I can imagine that because I've been there myself. So that's the second stage. And the third stage is caring. And so a con artist is really good at reading the emotions of other people. We would not say they're empathetic because they don't care. And so a child is really good at understanding when you're hurting, but they're not always good at knowing what to do about it. So you come home crying from work, they hand you a Band-Aid, which is sweet, but not what we'd want an adult to do. And so I think if you take these three branches of empathy and put them together, you have a pretty good basis of a moral behavior, but it's not just sentiment. It's sentiment with an intellectual component and then with a practical act of knowing what to do in that circumstance.
I agree, but I think to draw from our friend Nick Epley for a second, one important thing that can happen is that somebody's going through something that you are able to recognize has no echo in your own experience. Oh. In that instance, part of what matters is to be very quiet and allow them to express whatever they need to express to you, but to be available to them without supposing that you have a clue what they're going through. I don't have children of my own, so I don't think I can fully comprehend the sort of grief that a parent has when a parent has the incredible misfortune to outlive a child, one of their children, right? So faced with that kind of grief, it's true, I've known grief, But it's also true that nothing in me is capable of quite understanding that grief.
Nick has a very good phrase that we think we can do perspective taking, where I imagine take your perspective, and he says perspective taking doesn't work, but perspective receiving works. If I ask you.
Yeah.
Well, I'll just acknowledge David has a recent column in the New York Times on a friend who goes through depression. And it's the most stunning article I've ever read that's kind of reminded me of how hard real empathy is to fully intend and how we can't fully be in each other's shoes. So just a reading homework for those who want to go into that topic deeper.
Yeah, and I will just say quickly on that point that I tried to understand my friend's depression by extrapolating from my own moments of sadness, and that's not correct. He was in an entirely different state of consciousness.
Maybe a great segue to the final question, and I don't know if either of you have read Chloe Cooper Jones' recent beautiful memoir called Easy Beauty, but Terry Abruzzo asked about it in the chat, and she braids Murdoch's discussion of beauty throughout her stories. And essentially, she's someone who is disabled and trying to use this idea of how to look at beauty and then kind of reset your own expectations of self. And I don't know if either of you have a comment on that, but it kind of is a natural segue. And even if not on this book, on the idea of how can we kind of use our experience to, in nature and other places to kind of reset our own sense of beauty, and how that can even, in this case, be self-reflective and resetting expectations on ourselves, especially in a world where, to come back to last week, we are looking at mental health and all of these issues of wellness at a different level, partly because social media and those factors are telling us what beauty and other things are. And so just curious, maybe for any broader reflection, if you're not familiar with this work in particular.
Yeah. What's the name of the book, Seth?
It's called Easy Beauty by Chloe Cooper Jones.
Okay.
Yeah, I don't know this book either.
I don't know the book, but I will look it up. The thing that leaps to mind is A Moment of Moral Beauty. I had a friend who was he was told this story by someone he interviewed, and she and some friends had been I guess working at a soup kitchen one morning or somewhere feeding the hungry, and they were driving home and it was snowing, and there was one car that was going to drop four of them off, and they lived somewhat near each other. And one of the guys in the back of the car said, "Oh, I live here. You don't need to go up my street. It's snowy. Just drop me off here, and I'll get home." And so they dropped him off right there on the street, and then they turned around. He didn't go up the side street. 3 minutes before, they had passed a drive where an old lady was shoveling her driveway, and he went back to help the old lady. And somebody else who was in that car said, I felt I wanted to sing and laugh and cheer. I felt this moment of just joy and happiness. I wanted to go home and tell my roommates." And she is just overswept with what you would call moral elevation. And it's somewhat of an example, but it's just like a beautiful thing that happened. And she has this immediate impulse to rise up to it and then tell people about it. And that, when I think of beauty and morality, it's that kind of experiences. That's what I think of.
Candace, final word?
And that's the kind of thing I think about too. And my students have been commenting on those kinds of moments lately, and so I've given them as a present. The thing I say when I see somebody do such a thing, I say, on behalf of the universe, I want to thank you for having just done such and such. Right? I'm going to appoint myself a spokesperson for the entire universe at this moment and tell you how much the universe appreciates what you just did. And my students are starting to use this as a way of commenting on unexpected and gorgeous acts of kindness and generosity.
Well, speaking of generosity and kindness, thank you both for taking the time to be with us. And I truly think that what you've described over the course of this hour is the affirmation of why we have and need a Hyde Park Institute, and why we're so fortunate at the University of Chicago, because moral formation is not happening on its own, at least in the direction that it could. And these moral reflection opportunities in community really allow us to be intentional about the types of beauty that we want to seek in the world. And so thank you both for being our guides. A quick programming note that this discussion continues 1 week from today. And the beauty of Iris Murdoch's book is that it is 3 very separate essays. And so next week will continue in a very different domain, although many thoughts will, I'm sure, continue to flow through. Have great afternoons to everyone. And David and Candace, thank you again for your insight and the beauty that you brought to the conversation. Bye.
Thank you.
Thank you. Bye-bye.